Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to reflect on how the natural sciences can enrich a wider cultural dialogue, which includes both the scientific pursuit of understanding our world, but also the broader human search for meaning and significance in life. And of course, that's traditionally associated with religion. And I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'm delighted I can be with you in this digital mode. So here's the question. How can we develop an integrated worldview that incorporates both science and religion and which fosters dialogue between these two very significant and different elements of modern culture? But before I begin to engage these issues, let me just say how delighted I am to be part of this important event in Hungary, a nation which has a rich tradition of research and reflection in this area. And I myself have benefited from this because earlier this summer we met in Budapest for a memorial symposium for Professor Sir George Rada, a Hungarian biochemist who achieved eminence in the British scientific world. He served as chief executive of the Medical Research Council after his distinguished research career at Oxford University. And he was very important to me because he supervised my doctoral research in the university's Department of Biochemistry at Oxford in the early 1970s. And I owe an immense intellectual and personal debt to him. Now, I fell in love with the natural sciences as a teenager back in the late 1960s. I think I was prompted by the overwhelming beauty and complexity of the natural world around me, and also because of a deep sense of intellectual curiosity. How does our universe function? Why is the human mind able to recognize and represent this complexity? And what does our universe mean? Now, I soon realized that while the natural sciences could answer some of these questions, it certainly couldn't deal with the others, like what's this universe all about? As the philosopher Ian McGilchrist notes, we do need to find some kind of way of complementing analysis and synthesis. And McGilchrist writes, our talent for division, for seeing the parts, is of staggering importance, second only to our capacity to transcend it in order to see the whole. Now, science certainly helps us to identify those parts and to study them in isolation. But there's something about us as human beings that makes us want to bring them together and discover what they actually mean. Now, during the 1960s, many considered that Marxism, a worldview that then dominated Eastern Europe and was a very significant force in Western European academic life, provided a more comprehensive vision of life than that offered by the natural sciences on its own. And both Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had argued that Marxism could be considered a form of natural science for understanding human society, identifying the laws of social development, and providing a scientific framework for revolutionary action. As a teenager back in the 1960s, I found this approach very appealing, in fact, fascinating. And as a teenager back in those distant days, I believed Marxism might serve as an integrating framework. Then, while I was studying the natural sciences at Oxford in the early 1970s, I discovered Christianity. I discovered its intellectual and imaginative expansiveness, and that opened the door into a whole new way of thinking and living. Now, while Marxism has diminished in significance since the 1960s, the issue of how science intersects with other modes of thinking remains really important, especially in connection with religious ways of understanding and visualizing our world. After I completed my first degree in chemistry at Oxford, I shifted my focus to the biomedical sciences with George Rada. And by this stage, I developed a profound intellectual interest in bridging disciplinary boundaries. And that was part of my motivation to study theology at Oxford and embark on research in this field. And as you've heard, I later served as Oxford Professor of Historical Theology and eventually as its Professor of Science and Religion. But my main concern really has been to find some way of countering the fragmentation of human knowledge. That's been such a prominent feature of Western culture since the early modern period, and I think it's a problem. I believe it's important to develop intellectual tools that enable us to see the broader picture that lies beyond our experiences and observations of the world. And I imagine the Renaissance vision, I admire the Renaissance vision of a life that goes beyond purely scientific explanation, and includes its existential and affective meanings. And as I'm sure you know, many today are interested in reviving the vision of the polymaths of the European Renaissance, who could master multiple disciplines and integrate them within a coherent worldview. Now, our yearning for a coherent worldview is partly a response to our desire to integrate the multiple aspects of our world, engaging both our reason and our emotions as we try to create a rationally intelligible, but also existentially habitable view of our world. But before we begin to explore how this might be done, I think we need to consider a reasonable objection that might be raised against it. Why do you want to do this sort of thing? What's the point of doing it? I mean, surely this is a pointless undertaking, because many still believe that science and religion exist in a relation of conflict due to their cultural and intellectual incompatibility. And at a popular level, many people perceive science and religion to be incompatible, locked in a perpetual and fundamental conflict that simply lies beyond resolution. And if that's so, there's rather little point in having a serious discussion about how they might relate to each other. However, as many of you will know, this so-called conflict thesis is now recognized as a relatively recent invention, which came to prominence in the late 19th century. And since the 1990s, intellectual historians have systematically dismantled this thesis, calling into question its credibility. And the Oxford scholar John Hedley Brooke, who was one of my predecessors as an Idris Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford, has argued rigorously that scholarship in the history of science has revealed a very different picture. Because Brooke argues that the relationship between science and religion is complex. It can't be reduced to simple models. And he writes that the real lesson turns out to be the complexity. And Peter Harrison, who was my immediate predecessor as Idris Professor at Oxford, confirms this, pointing out, and I quote, that the study of the historical relations between science and religion does not reveal any simple pattern at all, such as this conflict narrative. And Harrison adds that for most of the time, religion has facilitated scientific inquiry. So most scholars now, I think, accept that the warfare narrative is historically questionable, even though it played quite a significant, perhaps even a foundational role in the new atheist movement of the early 21st century. But most scholars now agree there's no single normative way to understand the relationship between religion in general and the natural sciences. And if there's no predetermined or right way, then you and I are free to construct what seems to us to be the best way towards holding these together and bringing their insights together. Because science and religion are no longer viewed in essentialist terms as fixed entities with a permanent essence and identity. And this earlier inclination to essentialize both science and religion has caused many to overlook the significance of their historical and their cultural contexts. We've now recovered this, and with it, I think, a new way of making sense of their relationship in a much more positive, engaging, and basically interesting way. So there's a question here I think we just need to note, and that is this whole question of what the word religion means. Is there actually a universal thing called religion? Certainly there are religions like Christianity, Judaism, and so forth. The social psychologist Jonathan Jong has made some very significant contributions to the debate on how to define religion and differentiate it from its cultural alternatives. And for Jong, there is no such thing as religion. And the empirical evidence, he argues, clearly demands, and I quote, abandoning the deep-seated and intuitive assumption that religion is a natural kind, a category with an identifiable essence. I mean, some religions believe in God or gods, others do not. But I think that the challenges that we do face in defining the concept of religion do not cause us difficulties in trying to figure out the relationship between the natural sciences and individual religions. In other words, whatever the problems may be in this category of religion, we can still talk meaningfully about how we relate the natural sciences and Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism or whatever. And so I want to open up a discussion about why this might be an intellectually valid and also an existentially interesting undertaking. First of all, surveys consistently show that this question is considered to be personally significant by many people and intellectually interesting by others. The process of disciplinary fragmentation, which partly reflects the cognitive demands of mastering a substantial specialist literature, can easily, I think, result in a kind of bricolage, an unintegrated gathering of insights, rather than a holistic, integrated account of human knowledge. And I think there's a need for us in an age of fragmentation to find some conceptual or imaginative framework to bring things back together and to hold them together. So it seems to me that developing an integrated worldview is essential to provide our knowledge of the world from collapsing into disconnected specializations. So let me quote here from Pope John Paul II, who made what I think is a very wise comment. He said, "Our world seems to be in fragments, in disjointed pieces. And of course, it requires healing and integration." Albert Einstein was also concerned about disconnection between natural sciences and ethics, a question that became really significant in the use of atomic weapons against Japan in 1945. And Einstein, in a very famous lecture of 1939, made a point that I think is really important for our reflections at this conference. And it's this, that scientists can't rely on science to provide moral values. Einstein makes this point. The scientific method, he argues, is disconnected from the creation of moral values. So I quote from him, "The scientific method can teach us nothing else beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other. Knowledge of what is does not open the door directly to what should be. One can have the clearest and most complete knowledge of what is, and yet not be able to deduce from that what should be the goal of our human aspirations." So Einstein's point, I think, is very important. Scientists need to go beyond science in creating the moral values that might govern the use of their discoveries. They need to be interdisciplinary. For Einstein, there had to be some way of holding science and ethics together, allowing each to enrich, but also to correct each other. Now, I quoted a moment ago from John Paul II. Let me quote from him again. I want to note in particular his suggestion that, and here I quote, "Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world in which both can flourish." I think that's a very helpful and wise comment. Here's a second point I want to make. What we now call the natural sciences actually emerged from an earlier movement known as natural philosophy, which was highly influential in 17th century England. And a very good example of this approach is found in Isaac Newton's masterpiece, Principia Mathematica of 1687, which set out the core mathematical foundations of the ordering and behavior of the observed universe. Now, in popular scientific writings, natural philosophy is often described as, and I quote, "an older way of talking about natural science." But I want to tell you, that's a bit of an oversimplification. Because while natural philosophy certainly included what we now understand by science, it went far beyond it. Because natural philosophy was also a principled and informed effort to live meaningfully within the natural world and to treat it with respect. To use a very famous phrase of Robert Boyle, the scientist is a priest in the world of nature, a priest of nature. So the historical transition from natural philosophy to natural science has, in my view, resulted in a diminished emphasis on and interest in a spiritual, a moral, and an aesthetic engagement with the natural world. I think we need to recover it. And that means trying to have this transdisciplinary approach to things that allows us to bring disciplines together and weave their insights into a bigger picture. So for me, developing an integrated worldview, a bigger picture, could facilitate both the correlation of empirical facts and moral value, enabling us both to comprehend our world and also figure out how we ought to behave within that world. Now, of course, we want to understand how things work. That's what science's job is. But what do they mean? What do we mean? There is so much more that needs to be said if we're going to inhabit this world authentically and meaningfully. And my suggestion is that scientific insights might be complemented by other perspectives, ethical and religious, enriching our vision of this remarkable world that we inhabit. So I come to my third point. The models of engagement and correlation I'm going to explore in the case of science and religion can easily be expanded to include more general interdisciplinary questions, like, for example, the relationship between scientific and ethical thinking. As I was saying a moment ago, while the Renaissance ideal of the polymath is becoming increasingly challenging to uphold, it remains important to promote discussions across disciplinary boundaries. We need to find some way of integrating scientific insights from biology, from physics, from psychology into wider cultural conversations, for example, with theology and philosophy, rather than allowing them to remain isolated, disconnected in scientific research journals. Now, the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson emphasized this point in his book Consilience, which is a plea for the reconnection and reintegration of our fragmented world of knowledge. Listen to this often quoted quotation and see what you think. Wilson writes, "We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. The world henceforth will be run by synthesizers, people able to put together the right information at the right time, think critically about it, and make important choices wisely." Now, Wilson, I think, makes a good case for recovering a more integrated and coordinated way of understanding the relation of science and other areas of human reflection, particularly religion. But how can we do this? I think we need to develop a big picture, an integral worldview which holds the many aspects of the disciplines together. So how can we encourage the emergence of what Wilson calls synthesizers? Now, some might say we shouldn't be doing this. They will resist the idea of interdisciplinary collaboration because it amounts to disciplinary compromise. If my own discipline is self-sufficient, I don't need to talk to anyone else. We find these kind of claims to epistemic privilege, especially within scientific populism, which often adopts forms of what we now call scientism. Again, that word scientism. And for the Italian-American biologist and philosopher Massimo Pilucci, scientism is basically, and I quote him here, a totalizing attitude that regards science as the ultimate standard and arbiter of all interesting questions, or that seeks to expand the very definition and scope of science to encompass all aspects of human knowledge and understanding. So clearly, some are arguing that scientific method should be applied to all disciplines. I'm not one of those. I would suggest that human knowledge should not be determined by an imperialist approach to knowledge creation, in which one discipline is considered to be supreme and self-sufficient. I would want to argue for a federal, not an imperialist model, in which intellectual disciplines engage in civilized discussion and dialogue across their boundaries. In my view, science is primarily a method of knowing, in other words, an epistemology, rather than a comprehensive perspective on reality, that is, an ontology. I think that view is held quite widely. I mean, the British biologist Stephen Rose sets out a very similar position when he reflects on the complexity of the scientific endeavor to comprehend the world. Here's his conclusion as he reflects on the nature of biology. He writes, "I'm committed to the view that we live in a world that is an ontological unity, but I must also accept an epistemological pluralism. In other words, one world, but we need many methods if we're going to investigate it and represent it. And the point is that the natural sciences provide us with a remarkably effective and dependable method for exploring our universe, enabling us to grasp its complexity and its underlying rationality. And I consider that science has crucial insights to offer us in our reflections about the nature of the universe and human existence. But here's the point I want to emphasize. While science is reliable, it's also limited. We need to use multiple intellectual toolkits to engage our complex world if we're going to put together a coherent and total way of looking at ourselves and our world. Now, one of the most significant advocates of this position is the British public philosopher Mary Midgley. Now, Midgley points out, and I quote, that for most important questions in human life, a number of different conceptual toolboxes always have to be used together. Now, I got to know Midgley 20 years ago as we shared our common concerns about Richard Dawkins' scientific reductionism. We met, we compared notes, and we kept in touch. And I've developed her ideas since then, both to critique scientism and also to advance a theological understanding of life. Now, Midgley insists there's only one world, but she also emphasizes it's a complex world. It needs a wide range of what she calls distinct thought patterns if we're going to be able to understand it and avoid the risk of distortion or an inappropriate reductionism. If we limit ourselves to methods of science in general, or one science like physics in particular, then we needlessly lock ourselves into what Midgley calls a highly restrictive view of meaning. So here's the point. For Midgley, scientism is a form of epistemic imperialism. It needs to be replaced by a federal understanding of human knowledge production, which allows each intellectual domain to have its own distinct methods and norms, which it then offers to the community of knowledge as a whole, as part of the greater human quest for knowledge and understanding. And this, he suggests, is best visualized using the metaphor of mapping reality. Mapping reality. And here's the point that Midgley makes. Each discipline draws a map of reality using its own methods. And each map's important, but each map is also incomplete. And Midgley's point is that we need to find some way of bringing these maps together from different disciplines and trying to grasp the bigger picture that results. Each disciplinary map is incomplete, but when they're all taken together, they can illuminate our understanding of reality. No map shows us everything. Each discipline produces its own intellectual map, reflecting its own research methods and intellectual toolboxes. So what we need to do is take all these maps and somehow superimpose them so we can see the greater coherent whole that results. So let me now turn to think about how we might imagine the relation of science and religion. I want to suggest that two imaginaries, I'm borrowing here Charles Taylor's concept, are helpful in understanding how these insights might be integrated or these maps superimposed and correlate. And both the approaches I'm going to suggest have a long history of use. The first of these is to imagine science and religion as offering different yet complementary perspectives on reality. Again, science and religion are different, but being different does not mean incompatible. It means they have insights we need somehow to weave together. And I here draw on the approach developed by the Oxford theoretical chemist Charles Coulson, who died back in 1974. He used the idea of multiple perspectives as a heuristic device to allow the fundamental coherence of science and religion to be affirmed and explored, while also opening up connections with poetry, philosophy, and other areas of human thought. Now, again, Coulson was important to me. I got to know him personally during my first years at Oxford. I was at Wadham College. Coulson was a fellow there. And he helped me to think through my ideas on the relation of science and faith. And basically, my own views on science and religion today are basically simply an expansion of Coulson's. And while there are clearly difficulties with this approach, I think there are some really important positives. He doesn't really help us to understand whether all perspectives on reality are equally valid, but he does show us there are ways of bringing them together and holding them together. We might also, I think, note a second approach. And this understands science and religion as operating at different explanatory levels. In other words, each provides a partial explanation of a complex phenomenon. So if you like, there are multiple strata, multiple layers of reality, and different disciplines engage each stratum at a different level. So if you like, natural sciences offer a stratified approach to the natural world framed in terms of levels of explanation. Physics, chemistry, biology, psychology engage with reality at different levels, and they've developed different methods of investigation that are adapted to their own disciplinary competence. And the key point to bring out here is that we need to find some way of bringing together these different outcomes that result from engaging different levels of a complex reality. And this process of engagement includes philosophy, it includes religion. We need to find some way of holding these together and realizing that the explanations and understandings that result are not competitive, but are complementary. So let me draw on the distinguished geologist Frank Rhodes, who served as president of Cornell University from 1977 to 1995. He was a British emigre settled in America, and he set out a way of illustrating this approach that focuses on a very simple image. So in your mind's eye, would you think, please, of a kettle that is boiling, a kettle which is boiling? And Rhodes explores his multi-level approach to explanation by asking us to reflect on why that kettle is boiling. Now, one explanation is that someone turned on the kettle, causing energy conversion to raise the temperature of the water to a boiling point. But there's another explanation. The kettle is boiling because someone wanted to make themselves a cup of tea. Yes, Rhodes was British. Now, both of these explanations are correct. However, they address different levels of the phenomenon. And here's the key point we need to appreciate. The fact that one is right does not make the other wrong. The energy conversion explanation is right, but that doesn't stop the making a cup of tea explanation from being right as well. Taken together, these explanatory elements are conjunctive. They're not competitive. When you put them together, they provide a more comprehensive understanding of a situation than either can do on its own. They operate at different levels, and they provide us with a richer picture of a complex phenomenon. They're all snapshots in the panorama of a bigger picture. And Rhodes himself makes this point as follows. These are different answers, but both are true. Both are complementary and not competitive. One answer is appropriate within a particular frame of reference, the other within another frame of reference. There's a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. I like that. It's a very good summary. Each is incomplete without the other. So let me move on and ask, what are the motivations for wanting to interconnect the elements of scientific and religious ways of thinking? What benefits might result from an integrated worldview that might coordinate both scientific and religious elements? What broader purpose might a larger vision of the interconnectedness of science and religion serve? Here's a point I think is really important. Human beings seem to require a broader knowledge base than any single discipline can provide if we're going to live authentically and meaningfully. Now, some suggest, perhaps a little simplistically, that the sciences focus on how questions, whereas religion focuses on why question. Now, that I think needs some nuancing, but I think it's reasonable to argue there is a significant difference between clarifying the functionality of our world and determining its meaning. Now, most advocates of scientism will argue that that if we limit our insights to science alone, then basically we've eliminated moral values from serious consideration. You might think, for example, of Alex Rosenberg's book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality, in which he argues that science must be, and I quote, our exclusive guide to reality about our world and about ourselves. And this leads him to the conclusion, which is entirely valid given his assumptions, but in my view is just ridiculous. The view that moral values lack scientific validation. He asks this question: what is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. But I want to make the point that moral philosophers are not giving up on their thinking because of Rosenberg's conclusion. I would say that Rosenberg's conclusion is simply a demonstration that scientism is an inadequate and impoverished account of our world. I think, as you will all know, the philosopher Karl Popper uses the term ultimate questions to refer to the grand questions of life that science can't address using its own characteristic research methods. And science, according to Popper, does not make assertions about ultimate questions. But interestingly, Popper anticipates Rosenberg's views on ethics. This is what Popper says. Some great scientists, and many lesser ones, have misunderstood the situation. The fact that science cannot make any pronouncement about ethical principles has been misinterpreted as indicating that there are no such principles. And Popper goes on to make a good case for defending them. But there is a real issue here, and Popper is picking up on the point made by the 18th century philosopher David Hume, namely that there is a disjunction between natural facts and moral values. And for Hume, it's just not possible to move from non-moral premises to moral conclusions by purely logical means. And that, I think, is a real important point. Because, as Einstein pointed out, a scientifically informed approach to ethics requires reaching beyond the scope of the scientific method, explicitly or implicitly assuming some kind of integrated worldview that allows these connections to be affirmed. And early modern natural philosophers, like, for example, Johann Kepler, considered a belief in God and the divine creation of the universe could be a kind of bridging theory that could connect scientific reflection and the creation of a moral vision of how we should act in the universe. And if I may make a local example to make this point, I'll reference Tamás Demeter, who's professor of philosophy at the Corvinus University of Budapest. And Demeter argues, rightly I think, and I quote, that natural philosophers were studying God's creation and that this provided the basic ideological framework of early modern science. Now, Demeter shows how Johann Kepler's astronomical theories, especially his appeal to cosmic harmonies, are deeply grounded in a Christian anthropology, and that allows him to make connections which science on its own can't do. And that's a really important point. Let me quote here the American philosopher John Dewey. John Dewey, writing in the early 20th century, wrote, "There is a real problem, which we haven't succeeded in resolving. The deepest problem of modern life," he writes, "is that we have failed to integrate our thoughts about the world with our thoughts about value and purpose." And so I think there's a need for us to find a way of bringing together science and religion so there's an intellectual bridge between the natural sciences and deep human concerns about questions of meaning and moral values. And of course, it's well known, I think, now that religious belief provides exactly this kind of bridging framework. Robert A. Emmons, for example, is a psychologist who argues that it's a matter of empirical observation that religion can provide people with, and I quote, "a comprehensive and integrated framework of meaning that helps us to explain our own concerns or experience and connect up with something greater." let me focus on that final phrase, connect up with something greater. That's the missing element that we need to bring into this conversation. Because psychological research has established that human flourishing relies on a framework of meaning that enables our distinct identities and significance to be affirmed in a world that so often appears to be coherent and meaningless. But psychology can't tell us what is right. We need this bigger picture to find answers to those questions. And they're important questions. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz suggests that human beings are meaning-seeking animals who cannot live in a world they are unable to understand. So here we are with the point I want to emphasize. Human beings are regularly confronted with questions that lie beyond the capacity of the natural sciences to answer. Why are we here? Is my life meaningful? Yes, psychological research shows how important these questions are for well-being and flourishing. But they cannot answer those questions. We need to go beyond the natural sciences if we're going to make sense of the world and ourselves at the existential and moral levels. So let me end by reflecting again on the problems of disciplinary specialization, which so often creates difficulties for interdisciplinary dialogue and reflection. We need to find ways to transcend the limits of the individual disciplines without compromising their methods, while respecting their distinct identities. That's a key point. So let me come back to Pope John Paul II, who rightly suggested that we need to articulate and embody, and here I quote, a common interactive relationship in which each discipline retains its integrity and yet is radically open to the discoveries and the insights of the other. Now, perhaps this is best expressed using a musical metaphor. We've picked up on Kepler's image of cosmic harmony. Here's the Swiss Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar arguing that the best way of thinking about truth is symphonic. It's an integration of many voices within a coherent way of understanding our world. We can move from acknowledging the plurality and diversity of a universe to discerning a broader understanding of reality in which each element has its unique and rightful place while contributing to the greater whole. So let me end, if I may, by emphasizing this simple point. We need to develop a way of seeing our world that aims to integrate analysis with synthesis, that fosters flourishing rather than mere biological existence. And I hope this very brief presentation here this morning will begin to open up the rich possibilities here. I think such an exploration can be possible and fruitful, and we need to find some way of enabling these interdisciplinary conversations, which I think are both intellectually possible, but also personally enriching. Thank you so much for listening.